Hey everyone. So as we round out this particular unit in terms of thinking about climate change, we also want to be thinking about how the world has attempted to respond to climate change in the first place. So this sort of gets us into our major concept in so many ways for the last half of this particular unit of vulnerability. So when we're thinking about vulnerability to global climate change, it refers to the degree to which people are susceptible to or unable to cope with the adverse impacts of climate change. So are you highly vulnerable or do you have low vulnerability in terms of your ability to sort of respond to it in a way that um, is beneficial in some way? And there's three factors that are really associated with vulnerability, which I know we've talked about before. One is exposure, the degree to which people are exposed to climate change. So definitely exposure is higher at this point in places like sub-Saharan Africa, where the effects of climate change have been strongest to this point. You also have sensitivity, the degree to which they could be harmed by exposure to climate change. And then adaptive capacity, the degree to which uh, they could mitigate the potential harm by taking action to reduce their exposure or sensitivity. And so all of these three things together, not just whether you're feeling the effects of climate change or not, sort of dictate what your vulnerability is. And so this can include not just people, but also wildlife and institutions as well. So in terms of thinking about vulnerability, there's a couple different metrics that show who has higher vulnerability or less. And so certain groups are more vulnerable. For one, the very young, like young children. Two, elderly, those with disabilities, the poor, minority groups because of oftentimes they are given less resources within a given society, refugees who have had to oftentimes give up so many of their resources in order to move, indigenous people as well, because oftentimes they live outside of sort of the system of the state, and then those who physically are in care of others as well. And unfortunately, this oftentimes, uh, in a lot of societies, mean that women are more vulnerable because of this. So areas that are more vulnerable, low-lying islands, especially those in the Pacific and the Indian Oceans, like the Maldives, and on islands where much of the population lives on the coast. River mouths and valleys that can more easily flood, coastal areas, regions that get water supplies from mountain glaciers as well as those mountain glaciers melt, those populations are more impacted by these things. Now, in terms of thinking about indigenous people and vulnerability, there's a couple other vulnerabilities that indigenous people have, or native peoples. Indigenous peoples oftentimes live in extreme environments. If you think about Inuit tribes or Inuit cultural groups within the Arctic, places like Alaska or northern Canada, um, these are very, very extreme environments that are going to be more quickly impacted by the effects of climate change. They oftentimes experience socioeconomic problems. They live outside of the the formal economy oftentimes, and so very low incomes. Oftentimes they're further away from hospitals, so poor health, limited access to resources like water. And they've also have one thing that, makes them more vulnerable as well. They've adapted their traditional lifestyles that they've lived with sometimes for thousands of years to their environment. And so if the environment changes, everything about their lives change. And so this makes them extremely vulnerable because their economic and social life is tied to the climate. And if those things change and if that dependency on nature changes, and if nature changes itself, then that's a huge vulnerability. So we're going to look at two countries today that have sort of contrasting vulnerabilities to climate change in different ways. The first of these is Bangladesh, which we can see here, formerly part of India, however, and Pakistan, however, partitioned off. And we've talked about Bangladesh sometimes in terms of what they've done to sort of build infrastructure. But in terms of Bangladesh and what we're going to talk about today, it's really going to be tied to the flooding that goes on in Bangladesh. So looking at the geography, most of the country of Bangladesh forms a delta from three main rivers. Unfortunately, periodically, these flood the lands. And so these have traditionally been a good thing because they've watered crops, they increase soil fertility. However, since 1970, the amount of flooding that goes on, the intensity of it, the duration of those floods have increased. In addition to that, a further rise in 2.6 degrees Celsius will continue to lead to widespread repeated flooding. And so the potential flood damage is also likely to worsen. You're going to have saltwater intrusion, which will not help the land. It will make the land less likely to be able to have as high of a crop yield. And the current models are showing that monsoon rainfall season are going to expand by 14 to 40% by the 2030s and as much as 135% by the 2090s. And so the people are not going to be able to adapt as quickly to that. And so there's a high vulnerability in here. However, the Bangladesh government is doing things to make sure that they can deal with the flooding and start to combat climate change in some way. And so the fact that people's houses are built from sand and mud, and most people live in the Delta region are poor, lead to a higher vulnerability. However, the solutions may help to lower that vulnerability in some ways. So in 1988, Bangladesh government ended up developing its own flood action plan in order to protect the country from future flooding. They did things like set up sluice gates, which were built on a number of rivers, and we see that pictured above. And they also help to protect from flooding by tidal waves and from storm surges, which can increase the intensity of these floods. The government has also built up about 5,700 kilometers of embankments and 5,000 kilometers of drainage channels, which can help to ease if flooding were to occur and more quickly get rid of the water so that people can go back to hopefully their homes. They've also built a huge number of flood shelters, 200 in fact, and they've built these on stilts in order to aid in the evacuation of people that are affected by the floods. And so in that way, this has been a huge boost in terms of helping to, in some ways, lower the vulnerability to climate change as it continues to worsen. Now, the other case study we're going to look at is Switzerland. And so even though Switzerland is dealing with some other issues, we'll talk about the ways in which they have a lower vulnerability as well. Switzerland has certainly seen the effects of climate change. Even though it is different from how Bangladesh has experienced it, they are still experiencing the effects. Temperatures have warmed there considerably since pre-industrial times, over twice what the rest of the world has experienced, about 2 degrees for the Swiss, as opposed to about 0.85 degrees Celsius for everyone else. Glaciers have also lost about 60% of their volume to increase flooding in some areas. And so just like the Bangladeshi people, they have experienced flooding in this way. However, they're a very wealthy nation. And so much of this is built on the finance industry, so a lot of money flowing into the country. And even though they do experience their fair share of consequences for this, it does hurt tourism, of people going to the mountains for the glaciers, being able to see the glaciers, having snow year-round, where they've had a huge number of year-round ski resorts. Those have considerably lessened. They've, as much as 8 times less number of all year round ski resorts. And so this does hurt Switzerland. However, they are a less vulnerable population because of the higher elevation that they experience, but also the higher socioeconomic status of those within the country. So here we see a video. Hopefully you'll be able to watch that as you go through these notes. And at this point, I want us to go forward and look at the chapter excerpt in today's Schoology in order to answer the rest of the questions in the notes organizer. If you have any questions over this or anything from the chapter excerpt, please let me know. Other than that, have a great day.